Hey Phil, I want to start this episode with something that I don't think I've ever said out loud before on this show. So there's a decision I made in my first decade as a founder that cost me a number I'm still not really comfortable saying out loud. Not because the number was that big, but because the lesson was that obvious in hindsight. Okay. So we'll get to that number, but most founders try to optimize the first decade for growth. The ones who compound, from what I've now seen 2 decades in, are the ones that are still standing 20 years in. They optimize for something else, and that's wisdom. So today we're going to be sharing some of that wisdom that only comes from making the mistakes early enough to actually learn from them. All right, that's the opening. I'm Josh Notes. This is my partner sitting across from me and co-host Phil Maffei, and this is Financial Clarity Live. We're excited to be on here today. Phil, I know your first decade started off working in a big corporate environment, so maybe some of those mistakes were either others or, buried inside of group meetings. But based on what you've seen with folks that we work with that are a decade or less into their first decade of business, uh, where are the decisions that they make usually that seem obvious to you but not to them?
Oh, geez. A loaded question. It's hard to tell what's obvious to you and not obvious to somebody else. I mean, I think that's the nature of, having different functions within a business with different areas of expertise, right? I mean, I think a lot of the folks that we meet don't really have a very grounded view of the world that they can kind of objectively refer back to and understand, the implications of the decisions they're making on their, long-term financial health. I guess that's maybe the common thread.
Okay, perfect. So, um, yeah, I think I'm thinking about like cap tables that I'd like to unwind, the hire I'd kept too long, the customer that I built all the processes around, but really wasn't even the right type of customer for the business, or the number that maybe I hid from myself and my partners, not intentionally, but when I look back, it was like, man, we should have talked about that a lot sooner. So if this hits too close to home for anybody listening, that's the point. So let's go. All right, so equity decisions you can't unwind. So I feel like there's kind of two different types of folks we run into. It's not that there's a fork in the road, but there's folks who either don't want to ever give up any equity and hold on to it themselves, and therefore grow a much smaller potato, or the folks that look at equity as though it kind of is like this free thing that you can just hand out, and sometimes they even do that verbally, never actually exchanging paper for any set of terms, and they realize quickly that they're out of promises. So which one's more deadly, Phil?
Oh, definitely lighter for sure.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think that's a no-brainer.
yeah.
Totally.
You can learn from the first one and decide strategically to start sharing a little bit more with the right people. But I think if you go real early in and hand things out, I know there was a business I started. It was out of my parents' house, two partners, and we literally said on like day two, we're like, "What do you think? Like a third, a third, a third?" And like we hadn't even figured out what the business was or what we were doing. So it's like we were
That's
splitting up a pizza in college. I guess that's a fair way to do a pizza, but I don't think it's a good way
right,
to
right.
run a business.
I would tend to agree. Two different things. You know.
All right, so if we're thinking about structuring a cap table like permanent architecture, and you're talking to a founder who owns 100% of the company, but things are inflecting like right now. It's the middle of June, maybe early July in 2026, and things are ramping, and they know they got to bring some equity support in because they don't have enough cash and they're not quite ready at the business model standpoint to really do a big raise. How do you help set them up for success?
So ultimately important to have the long-term perspective in mind and then work backwards from there, right? So the folks who are inclined to not give any away, I think you kind of point them to the direction of it. Sometimes it's better to have a smaller piece of a bigger pie. And then, the other side of the coin, right, is, on making folks understand the importance of maintaining a, majority ownership in the business from a business making perspective. And then, you know, ultimately that's not just one round of fundraising, right? This happens a couple of different times, and if you're not careful, you can dilute your way out of ownership of the business that you started. So I think it's depending on what end of the spectrum you're on. It's ultimately understanding what the long-term goals are, how much cash you actually need, right? A lot of folks don't, they think of nice round numbers, but not really understanding what they're going to do with that cash once they actually get it all, right? So, I think there's a lot of things that go into it in any unique particular circumstance, but ultimately it's understanding, what does this look like after the dust settles and I do all these things, and does that still align with my objective, right? And what I'm trying to do internally.
Yeah. I've got a, I think when you think about how you want to roll this out, I think you want to land it slow and clean, even if things are moving really fast in the organization. Um, I think so many people, like, their only influence of how this works is by watching Shark Tank, and so they're like, I don't know, like 8% for 300K, or like whatever number they just kind of pull out. They have no justification of the valuation, um, and they kind of act like that the other side is going to just say yes, right? It's going to usually be a negotiation. So we got there on the screen, like, don't sign the equity papers in the same conversation when you negotiate them. Like, it's probably best to create a little air, a little space, maybe discuss them. Think of it as like, hey, I wanted to have a starting conversation around this, and hopefully within this period of time, find something that works for all parties. I think that's the less NBC produced version of this, because these cap table mistakes that you make, we're not suggesting they're easy, but they don't ride up the elevator, right? They live in the foundation of the organization, and they ultimately kind of set what's possible. So it's important to get them right. Anything else before we jump to the next principle?
No, I think you could talk a lot about that stuff, but yeah, I think generally speaking, that is correct.
There we go. All right. Most expensive hire isn't the wrong one. It's the right at the time one. You didn't transition fast enough. So I know what this was in my first decade. It was a COO. Guy had a lot of experience. He kind of worked for the organization that oversaw the technical trade that we were in. And he, for whatever reason, lost his job at that organization. We felt like he would help elevate our entire organization if we brought him in. So we, had a great lunch, a great drink with him. And next thing you know, we had a 6-figure salary on the books that, I don't know, 15 months later looked really stupid. But
Mm-hmm.
at the time, it was like, man, this is going to elevate the whole company. We were in our early 20s, so there wasn't a lot of age and wisdom in the room. And, it was really hard once we built the organization around this guy to say goodbye ultimately, which is what ended up happening, and also to kind of unwind some of the cultural things that changed once we brought him in. You've seen this, Phil, working with our clients.
Yeah.
What do you got to say on the topic?
I mean, I think it's, I think you're alluding to, right? The timing is everything. And, we work with clients, right? Raised a bunch of money. They had a great projection and they were going to ramp real quickly, and they start hiring a bunch of folks. And then, things don't materialize as quickly as they had assumed. And now you're turning around and you got to fire a bunch of those folks that you just hired over the last 3 to 6 months, which is expensive, right? There's severance packages involved and all of that stuff, and not to mention, kind of what you're alluding to, right? All of the core operational things that get turned on their head as you're trying to, destroy your culture as you carve out half of the workforce, right? So, understanding the timing of the hiring is important, and in the context of what the return on that investment is, right? Where if you think it's going to add value to the business, you should be able to quantify what that looks like, and be able to justify the hire in that fashion, not just, oh, this guy's going to elevate our game, right? That sounds good on paper, but like, what does that actually mean, right? Like, what
Yeah,
is the return of the investment?
I think if we would have, like, literally just workshopped this one hire for one night between me and my two partners, like even just playing pretend, like charades, like, hey, let's tell the other founding members of this team that we've just done this and how this is going to work out. And it was like, just putting the numbers on the board would have made us run away from this decision, because we were working out of a home office, out of my friend's mom's house, like in the basement section. And then we got a guy coming in who's like, I need a corporate car. And he's driving in from, like, Manhattan. And it's like, those two things just don't really, they're never going to match up.
That's right. That's right. I think that's the first sign you're probably out over your skis, right? You know.
Yeah, yeah. But man, it sure felt good to say it the first time. Man, yeah, we got the COO of the big corporation that oversees our whole industry. Everybody's like, "Wow, that's great." It's like, yeah, well, what return was there on that decision?
Yeah, and you
Mm,
got fired from that job for a reason, right? You know.
that's probably right. Um,
If it was that valuable to keep around, I would have kept them.
that's right. All right, we're gonna keep it moving here. So biggest customer can be your most expensive lesson. So concentration risk, this one definitely happened. It was really painful. In our world, it was working within the utility infrastructure. And so, as you know, a utility tends to be a monopoly. And so there is nobody else in town to go with. And as we got further and further wrapped around basically the largest customer, there was also a merger that occurred. So the other large customer to the south of us became the same customer. And all of a sudden we're at 80% concentration. And that was great. And, the program implementer was singing our praises. We were contractor of the year. We got elevated to a national, trade association meeting. I still got the trophy in my, in my pile over here. But what we didn't see coming was that one mistake, literally one mistake, could cost us the business. And that in this case, it was the program implementer. Um, they decided that their quality assurance program wasn't fully needed because we were doing so well. So they didn't quality assure a job that we did. We did everything right. And we installed over $1 million of energy equipment into a secure military installation. And it was on the wrong meter. So it was no longer eligible for the rebate. And we were out that $1 million. So that was my situation. That sucked. Phil, how have you seen this play out?
I think this probably smacks people in the face the most during like a diligence process and some of the M&A activity work that we do, where this is a huge point of contention for all of the reasons you just mentioned, that anybody who's savvy is going to be looking at what am I acquiring, and if it's just one customer, right, even if that's a big customer, there's a huge risk there, and it's ultimately going to dilute value, right? So we see a lot of that when we're going through that process and talking to potential suitors for our existing clients, right? This is something that anybody who's savvy is going to be really keying in on. And if you don't have if you have a lot of risk and all of your eggs in one basket, as they say, you're behind the eight ball from a negotiating perspective for sure, because you don't have a good answer for what happens to the business if you lose that customer.
That's right. All right. So every founder's got a number they didn't look at often enough. I think for ours, I'll take number 3 here, cash conversion cycle. So same situation. We're tied around really one batch of customers, and it's in this programmatic cycle, and there's 3 layers of bureaucracy just to get paid. I can tell you the day that I realized that this number was. It was a Tuesday. We had a payroll to run on a Friday, and we hadn't gotten the normal batch of checks. So as I called in through layers and layers of bureaucracy and got nothing except for promises for callbacks, the hours were shrinking towards the payroll. So I'm not going to act like I'm a hero in this situation, but I couldn't face my employees on Friday. So on Wednesday, I went and I did a sit-in. So the way that works is you show up at 8:45 and you probably should pack lunch because you don't know how long you're going to be there. And I literally sat in the lobby until I got the check. I didn't make any threats. The police were not called, but it ended up being about 6:30 that evening before I actually got the check in hand. But that was just, the 4 weeks we were already behind. It didn't make up for the fact that we were running a 9-month cash conversion cycle, which is really difficult to do without a ton of cash, which we didn't have. So this kind of was a wake up moment where I realized like the business model we had was effectively broken because we would never swim out of this situation. And we were already too concentrated in this one program that had a really poor cash conversion cycle for the small player we were with no capital backing. You pick a number, Phil. Which one do most folks not talk about enough, early enough?
Yeah, I think what the middle one here is alluding to is I think there's there's an element of your fixed versus your variable costs that are embedded in your business. And if a lot of folks we work with, in the beginnings, they're not really capturing their data at a granular level of detail that's going to give them all of these what were discounts versus returns versus all of these other ins and outs that ultimately slide with the sales and the ebbs and the flows, right? Returns or whatever it is. So being able to accurately capture and categorize and analyze things is often a place where we're working so that folks understand what are the margins we're working with, right? What's going to scale as the revenue scales, and what are those fixed costs that margin needs to cover? And then ultimately, right, if you kind of have all those pieces of the equation, you know how much revenue you need to be able to break even, right? And whatever that gross versus net world looks like.
So, Phil, as always, you just ground us in reality. I'm going to give the founder view. So you're strapped in on this ride, and you're looking at some numbers that you probably don't look at frequently enough. And there's one of them that every time you look at it or talk about it with your partners, it feels like that point. I know, Phil, you're not going to like this, but on the roller coaster, when you're about to kind of go over the precipice and you feel your stomach drop, like that's the number that is probably telling you the truth about your business model that you're avoiding. Uh, that's at least how I experienced it. Is I would kind of get close to it and then I would run away from it and use some justification to explain why it was okay that we weren't getting our money for 3 more quarters. All right, man, this is like financial therapy. Neither of us have a license to practice. All right, so we talk about hopium. Okay, I hope that it was actually Anyways, hopium or hope is not a financial strategy. So if these words are coming up of like, well, hopefully, and well, if everything works out, well, it would be best if those are the words that you're starting sentences when you're explaining things in your forecast, then you probably are only looking at the best case forecast and you're making a bunch of really risky decisions. I don't know, Phil, where do you see hope coming into view in the conversations, and how do you put out the hope fire without losing our job?
I mean, that is oftentimes the role that the finance guy in the room is playing, right? Is the the wet blanket, as I say sometimes, or the Debbie Downer, because going to be the one to challenge all of the pie in the sky assumptions. And like you said, right, it's like, well, all the stars align and this happens. Like, as we know in life, the stars very infrequently align just as we want them to. So I think this is also another very common archetype of not really knowing what to look at or how to look at it, and then as a result you're making decisions flying off of assumptions that are probably a little bit rosier than what you'd want them to be, right? So there's definitely an approach from our seat where you want to base all of this hope and whatever it may be and in the underlying data, and if the objective data is giving you reason to believe that, then that's all the better. But it's not just kind of guessing, but ultimately making a decision based off of objective data.
Yeah, and I mean, as much as it stinks to be out of product or service because you outstripped your demand by not growing the team fast enough, it's way more painful on the other side to have everybody kind of staring at you with no customers lined up. So
Right.
that is the rough situation that a lot of folks sit in, which is they don't want this, so they pick something that feels more exciting, but then they realize how costly that excitement is when it was based around hope. So, all right. I did do a lot of reflection after that first decade. And that first decade, as many folks know, ended with a bankruptcy, both personal and in business. It wasn't the end of my road. It was the beginning of this one, in a way. And the first thing I kind of did after I took care of the team and dealing with the bank and the bankruptcy attorneys and all that was, I did a lot of reflection, introspective, journaling, and trying to understand what mistakes I actually made and which ones were the lessons that I needed to learn, and maybe how could I help others, and actually led to a couple opportunities that led to Sustain becoming, this agency, and hopefully helped a lot of our clients along the way. But here's what I wasn't doing during that decade that I should have been doing more of, right? Quarterly postmortems, should have been really journaling more frequently than waiting until the end. And also a lot of documentation around things that were being gained as knowledge, but not necessarily passed along. Phil, this wasn't your decade. I mean, we talked as friends at the time, but what do you feel like on the reflective side of things, other than just the numbers that you've seen, can really lead to wisdom setting in so that mistakes at least aren't repeated?
Yeah, I think I've worked places for long enough where we would go back and look at long-term projections that we had made several years prior to making them, and realizing how wildly wrong we were, right? And the further out you go, the more this magnifies itself for the most part. So it's the concept that while you're going through this, I think what most folks lose sight of is that the objective isn't really to be 100% accurate. It's to go through the thought exercise and play out all of these potential outcomes and what you would do in those scenarios, right? It's like the old Mike Tyson. Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? So it's the planning is important, and going back and doing the post mortem on that is important, and being humble enough to realize that no, you're not going to be right, but to see where you're off or where you were right or where you overestimated or underestimated just makes you better at being grounded in what you think is going to happen in the future, right? And it makes you better at going through that exercise, building the muscle of trying to predict those, known unknowns. You're going to get hit with stuff that you're not expecting. So, how do you plan for that? How do you how do you plan and rally your team around, this bigger picture, knowing that, you're going to pivot along the way as things come to light, and life happens and business happens, and you gotta pivot in the near term without losing sight of that longer term goal, and where you're trying to go, right? So I think that's
Yeah.
the gets lost in the sauce here a lot of the time.
Yeah, I bring me back to kind of, my kids are getting older now, and they understand what I do as an entrepreneur, and they ask me questions, and they're like, "What are you really good at?" And I was like, I think what I've gotten really good at, it's really what you just described, is being willing to kind of, in a short period of time, look back at what just happened, recognized what happened versus what I thought might happen. And then instead of beating myself up for the fact that it never is going to happen how you think it's going to happen, saying, okay, what did I learn from that? And kind of detaching the ego from that conversation with yourself so that you can actually learn from it, not just, give yourself lashings, right? The whole purpose of this is the learning exercise. And like you said, it's like a muscle that you build. And, I don't think you can really start too young. I think a lot of people, unfortunately for them, these are learned in childhood with, they make a mistake, their parents call them out on it, they feel shamed. And then it's like, move on to the next thing with shame instead of lessons. And so, I'm not going to teach parenting on this episode, but that's what I found is a healthy way to deal with this as you become an adult. And obviously, if you're a business owner, you need to be ready to be wrong a lot and learn from those mistakes. All right. Well, what can you do Monday? So 4 moves, 15 minutes total to start compounding the next decade from the last one that taught you everything. So write down your worst decision, 3 sentences, and why you made it. Write down your best decision, in 3 sentences, and why you made it. Find the pattern. What was the present in the best and missing in the worst? And then name the principle, and to commit to a guiding rule for the next decade, right? And this is, maybe you don't do this every week. Maybe it's once a quarter. Maybe it's something you do with your team. But we're saying wisdom isn't what happens to you. It's what you record after it happens. If you miss the documentation period, well, you might have missed the lesson along with it. Look, if you're sitting here going, man, I'd love to do this with my financials and figure out where I'm at, I got great news. You can get financial clarity right here. Take a snapshot of that QR code. You will get a 3-minute, 15-question diagnostic that will lead you to a Zoom call with me. I'm going to meet you wherever you're at. We're going to talk about what's going on. No heavy sales pressure, just an honest conversation about what we've learned and what might be the next best move for you and your team, whether you end up working with us and our team or not. Well, Phil, as always, I like to give you the last word. when we're talking about, looking back on the past decade and ahead to the next? What do you got?
I mean, I always like to say is to be old and wise, you must first be young and foolish. So,
Hmm,
don't beat yourself too much up in the early days. I think it's, as we're echoing here, it's a growth process, and you gotta grow with it, right? And the same, if you're the same person you were 10 years ago, you wasted a decade. Right?
beautiful. All right. Well, Um, we've already got you your financial ops assessment. That was the 3 minutes. If you like what you heard and you want to hear more, join our newsletter, Finance in Focus, for weekly financial tips, updates, and Q&A from this episode. And then we look forward to seeing you next week, 3 p.m. Eastern, for our next episode where we're going to help you gain financial clarity live. Take care and thank you.